It started with a whisper. Not one of voices, but of chains dragging softly over the dirt floor beneath the kitchen, where I worked day and night. My name was Clara. They called me girl most days, that one on better ones, and nothing at all when I was invisible. I was the kitchen slave, tucked into the back of the plantation house like a forgotten drawer. But I remembered everything, every look, every word, every cruelty they thought I didn't feel. And that's how the plan began, as a feeling I couldn't shake. You'd think someone like me, someone who lived by the hiss of boiling pots and the sting of cracked knuckles, wouldn't have time to dream. But the mind is a cruel comforter. I dreamed constantly. Not of freedom, no. I didn't know what that even looked like. I dreamed of turning the table. I dreamed of watching their eyes widen with fear, the way mine did every time I heard his boots on the kitchen floor. Mr. Halford, the master of the house, was a man made entirely of rules and rage. His cane was heavier than necessary and rarely used to walk. I still have the marks, though I wear them like lace now, fragile but carefully placed. His wife, Miss Annalise, was cold in another way. She never hit me, never raised her voice. She just looked through me like I was steam from her morning tea. And yet it was her silence that taught me to be loud in my own head. Then came the son, Ellis, a boy raised on sugar, taught to eat with silver and speak with poison. At 15, he was already mimicking his father's cruelty. At 16, he called me into the drawing room and made me kneel just to untie his shoes. That day, something clicked inside me. It wasn't rage. It was knowing. Knowing that no matter how careful I was, how silent I stayed, they'd never see me as more than hands. So I started listening. The kitchen was the pulse of the house. What they didn't realize is, I heard everything. Conversations between masters and merchants. Whispers from visiting men about money problems. Annalise crying in the hallway when she thought the staff was asleep. Every tick of their lives passed through my ears like a sermon, and slowly, carefully, I began collecting their secrets. On a humid night in July, I heard the first thread unravel. Ellis had borrowed money, lots of it, from a trader in Charleston, not for books or land. No, it was for a gambling debt, one that had grown like mold. Mr. Halford found out, and the shouting shook the china cabinets. I was peeling onions, but I didn't cry. Not from those onions, anyway. That's when I realized the house was rotting from the inside. I didn't need to break it down. It was already falling. I just needed to help gravity along. I started testing my invisibility. I lingered longer in doorways. I let my steps be a little heavier on the staircase. I even looked directly at Mr. Halford once. Just once, he looked away first. The plan wasn't formed then, not fully, but the seed had sprouted. And it was fed by every insult, every slap. Every morning I woke up with the taste of metal in my mouth from clenching my jaw all night. I knew I needed help, not from anyone in the house. But there was one place where eyes didn't follow, where mouths stayed shut, the smokehouse. Old Moses, the groundsman, kept it padlocked. But I had seen where he hid the key. He trusted me in a quiet way, enough to hand me tools without asking questions. I waited until dusk one evening, said I was fetching salt pork for supper, and slipped inside. What I found made my heart race. Rusty blades, rope oil, and something else, old ledgers. Moses had been tracking something, deliveries, disappearances, names crossed out in thick pencil. I didn't understand it all, but I didn't need to. All I knew was that secrets lived in the smokehouse, and now I had keys to them. I started leaving small notes there, tucked beneath a wooden crate. At first they were just questions. Do you watch them too? Do you know what Ellis did to Lily? Can we end this? No name, no signature, just words. They disappeared by morning, and sometimes new ones took their place. I remember. Soon, I didn't know who was replying. Maybe it was Moses, maybe not. But I wasn't alone anymore. Then one evening, as thunder rolled low across the fields and lightning flickered like an angry lantern, I heard Ellis in the corridor laughing drunk, slurring something about Lily again. But this time I stepped out of the shadows, just for a second, just long enough for him to see me, standing straight, not kneeling. He blinked, like he'd seen a ghost. Maybe he had. From that moment, I stopped hiding my gaze. I let them feel my presence. I started preparing meals with quieter steps and louder thought. I counted every teaspoon of spice, every knot in the table's wood, every squeak in the floorboards. My world was small, but my mind stretched beyond their fences. And then came the storm. Not outside, inside. Mr. Halford's finances collapsed. Ellis fled in the night. Miss Annalise took to her bed, claiming migraines. The plantation was crumbling. And me? I was just setting the table for supper, like I always did. Only now I added a pinch of something new to the meal. Not poison, not yet, just damp. Because when you want to destroy someone who's held a whip over your back for years, you don't do it with fury. You do it with precision. You do it with patience. And I had all the time in the world. The days that followed were quiet, but it wasn't peace. It was the kind of silence that comes before a crack of thunder, when the air smells like copper and every breath feels borrowed. Something was shifting. Mr. Halford wasn't riding into town as often. He stopped inviting men over for brandy and cigars. Instead, he spent long hours in his study with the door locked, barking at anyone who knocked, except me. He'd call, "Girl," and I'd enter without expression, balancing a tray of stale cornbread and weak coffee. But I was watching. The papers on his desk were no longer contracts or plantation records. They were letters, desperate ones it seemed. I once caught the words loan, default, and auction. I pretended not to notice, but in my head I folded each word like linen, filed it away. Then came the ledger. It was tucked beneath a pile of crumpled envelopes. When Mr. Halford stepped out to fetch a bottle, I opened it. Names, dates, prices. Not of goods, but of people. Sold, traded, loaned like cattle. My own name was there, in faded ink. Clara, $350. That number sat in my stomach like a stone. I wasn't a person to them, just a figure in a column. But even that couldn't prepare me for the page near the end. The one labeled upcoming, 3 names. One was mine, another was old Moses, the third. I shut the book with shaking hands, placed the coffee just where he liked it, and walked out without a sound. That night I returned to the smokehouse. Another note waited beneath the crate. "Ready when you are." The words made my pulse throb in my throat. I replied with just one word: tomorrow. The next day was Sunday. A day of worship for them, a day of labor for us. I braided my hair tighter than usual, dressed in my plainest clothes, and stirred the morning grits with the weight of a decision sitting on my shoulders. I didn't speak much. Didn't need to. Everything was set. Lily wasn't in the kitchen that morning. Miss Annalise had taken her upstairs days ago, said she wanted a maid of gentler manner. We all knew what that meant. I hadn't seen Lily smile since. She moved like a ghost, eyes down, shoulders curled inward. But I saw her once, in the hallway mirror, touch her belly. Barely a curve yet, but enough to silence any denial. Ellis had left his last cruelty behind. I walked to the barn just after noon, pretending to fetch eggs. Moses was waiting, sharpening a blade that didn't belong to any farming tool. His eyes met mine, steady, unreadable, and then he nodded toward the crate behind him. Inside were small bundles. Not weapons, supplies, clothing, candles, a map, a plan. "We leave after the fire," he said simply. The fire. I knew what he meant. It was late afternoon when I stepped into the dining room with a supper tray. Roast chicken, collard greens, sweet potatoes. Nothing seemed unusual, except the silence. The Halford family was already seated. Mr. Halford at the head, cane resting against the chair. Miss Annalise across from him, pale and tight-lipped. Lily stood at her side, refilling water glasses. And Ellis had returned, sunburnt, eyes red-rimmed, lips twisted in a lazy grin that made my skin crawl. "Well, look what the rats dragged back," Mr. Halford muttered. Ellis just laughed and raised a glass. "To debt," he said. "May it never run out before the liquor." The family chuckled. I did not. I placed the tray on the sideboard and turned to leave, but Ellis caught my wrist. "You remember how to play piano, Clara," he said, loud enough for the room to freeze. My breath caught. I hadn't touched the keys in years, not since I was dragged away from my mother's quarters at 13 to learn usefulness. Play something sweet for us. For old times. My heart pounded, but I nodded. Better to play than resist. I walked to the corner where the dust-covered piano stood. I sat, lifted the cover, and let my fingers press down, not on notes but on memory. I played the song my mother taught me, a lullaby with teeth, the one she hummed after each whipping to keep my tears from boiling over. And as I played, I saw Lily's eyes lift. For the first time in weeks, she looked straight at me. That's when I saw it. Her hand trembling as it held the glass pitcher, her eyes widened slightly. And then I smelled it, smoke. The fire had started. It wasn't inside the house, not yet. It had begun in the barn, controlled. Managed, just enough to draw attention away from the kitchen, from the dining room, from the smokehouse. Moses was keeping his word. I struck the final key with force, stood and said, "Dinner's served." Then I walked out without waiting for permission. I didn't go back to the kitchen. I slipped through the servants' entrance, past the back porch, and into the grove behind the house where a bundle was buried beneath a loose patch of earth. My escape pack. The fire bell rang then, wild and urgent. Shouts echoed across the property. Mr. Halford's voice boomed, followed by the clatter of chairs. I didn't run. Not yet. I had one more thing to do. I crept around the house toward the upper level. Lily's window was cracked. I had taught her that, to leave it open if she needed help. I climbed the lattice, ignoring the bite of thorns in my palms. She met me there, eyes full of terror. Is it time? She whispered. I nodded. She didn't take anything. Just slipped out the window and followed me into the woods, her bare feet silent on the damp earth. Behind us, the fire spread. I wasn't supposed to be anywhere near the master's orchard. That patch of green was reserved for his table, his wine, and his sense of power. But one late afternoon, while fetching a pail of water from the well nearby, I caught sight of Miss Clara, standing alone beneath the peach trees. Her hair glowed like copper fire in the sinking sun, and she was holding something, a handkerchief maybe, twisting it nervously. Normally, I'd keep my distance, but something about the way she kept glancing toward the woods and biting her lip told me this wasn't a casual walk. I ducked behind the trunk of an old pecan tree and watched, heart pounding. My mama always warned me, a curiosity's a candle in the wind. It'll light your path or burn your house down, but I didn't listen, and that's when he arrived. Thomas. He stepped out from the tree line like a shadow being born from the dusk. Tall, lean, with the kind of swagger a man builds in secret places. Not a white man. No, Thomas was one of us. But he wasn't like us either. He worked in the stables, but had favor with the master. Too much favor, some whispered. It was rumored he'd fought for the Confederacy as a servant, and that he'd come back speaking with that strange mix of pride and shame. They met in the middle of the orchard like lovers in a play. I couldn't hear their words, but their body language was loud. Clara reached for his hand, and he pulled back. She stepped closer, and he looked over her shoulder like he was afraid to be seen. Then she kissed him, just like that, like the world wasn't spinning around them, like no one could see. I swallowed hard and backed away, my feet crunching twigs underfoot. That tiny sound cracked the scene open like an egg. Thomas turned. Clara turned. Why, I froze. He stared right at me. We didn't move. 3 statues caught in a moment that shouldn't exist. Then Clara whispered something to Thomas, and he took a step toward me. My body screamed to run, but my pride nailed me to the ground. You lost? He asked, voice low and even. I stood taller. No, sir, just passing through. He came closer, eyes sharp. You saw. I shook my head slowly. We didn't see nothing but trees and sky. He stopped an arm's length away. His voice dropped to a growl. You say a word, girl, and you won't live to see another sunrise. I believed him. Clara remained where she stood, her face pale, arms crossed tightly. I let her go, she said softly. She won't talk. Thomas didn't move for a long beat. Then he turned and walked back to her, taking her hand again as if nothing had happened. I backed out of the orchard and didn't look back until I'd reached the kitchen steps. My hands trembled as I set the empty pail down, and I tried to act like nothing was wrong. But something had shifted. I'd stumbled upon a secret worth dying for. That night, the dreams came back. But this time, they weren't about my own suffering. They were about Clara and Thomas, and a fire consuming the orchard. I woke up drenched in sweat, my breath ragged. Mama noticed. She always noticed. You've been somewhere you shouldn't, she said as she braided my hair before morning chores. I didn't answer. You seen something? She pressed. I hesitated, then nodded. She sighed, slow and deep. Then you best forget it. Some things ain't ours to carry. But the thing was, when you carry fire in your belly, forgetting ain't so easy. The next few days passed like fog. I kept my head down and did my work, but every time I passed Thomas or Clara, my stomach twisted. Then came Sunday. Church days were the only hours we were allowed to breathe like people. The master's family would ride to town, leaving us a sliver of silence. The older folks would lead songs under the big oak, and the children would listen with wide eyes and open mouths. On this Sunday, I stayed behind in the laundry house, pretending to have extra work, but I wasn't alone. Clara came to me. She wore a yellow dress that made her look like a walking sunbeam. Her hands were clasped so tight her knuckles were white. I need to speak with you, she said, eyes darting to the doorway. I wiped my hands on a cloth. Yes, Miss Clara, she stepped closer. You saw, didn't you? I didn't answer. She nodded like she already knew. Please don't say anything. I love him. Her voice cracked on the last word. I raised an eyebrow. I love don't always mean safe. Her lip quivered. I know, but if anyone finds out, they'll kill him. And me. My father, he's got plans. He's promised me to someone already. A man twice my age with a temper worse than a bull in heat. I stared at her. Why are you telling me this? Because I think you understand what it's like. To be trapped in a life you didn't choose. I didn't respond, but I didn't walk away either. She took that as permission to continue. I have a plan, but I need your help. Now my heart truly began to race. Help her and Thomas, after the threat he gave me. I'm not part of your story, I said, voice trembling. But you could be, she said. You could help change it. I don't know what made me agree. Maybe it was her desperation. Maybe it was the way my own life had been twisted by other people's choices. Or maybe I just wanted to finally make a choice of my own. I looked her in the eye. One condition. She blinked. Anything. You keep me and my mama safe, is it? No matter what. She nodded. I swear it. And with that, the first thread of the plan was spun. What happened next unraveled everything we thought we knew. By Monday morning, Clara's planner had grown from a whisper into a weight on my back, heavier than any basket of linens I ever carried. I didn't sleep that night, and neither did Mama. She knew I was holding something in, and that something was about to boil over. Clara found me near the spring at dawn. I was rinsing sheets, cold water stinging my fingers, when she appeared like a ghost in her riding cloak. I have it, she whispered. She unwrapped a folded piece of paper from inside her cloak. It was creased and smudged, but the words were clear. A map. Away through the woods, a path to Charleston. She'd marked it with a trembling hand and a cold pencil. Oh, you're going to run, I asked, my voice sharper than I meant. She nodded. We both are. I almost laughed. You think someone like me can disappear that easy? I don't get second chances, Miss Clara. You won't have to run. Just help me get out. Once I'm gone, my father won't care what you saw. I stared at the lines on the paper, a trail winding past the old miller's farm, down to the river fork. It was dangerous, traveled by thieves, snakes, and worse. And Thomas, I asked. She hesitated. He'll meet me in 2 nights. He has arrangements. Arrangements. That word sat wrong on my tongue. Still, I nodded. And my mama, if she stays, she'll be safe. My father won't know, but that was a lie. We both knew it. Still, I folded the map and tucked it into my apron. What do you need me to do? Clara glanced over her shoulder. I'll leave the pantry door open tomorrow night. We'll hide there till they've all gone to bed. Then we slip out the north gate. That's simple. But nothing in a slave's world is ever simple. The next night, the air felt thick with secrets. I moved to the kitchen like a ghost, stirring stew, slicing bread, washing plates. But my mind was far from the fire. I could feel Thomas watching me from the barn. He never approached, never said a word, but he was watching, for a word. When I finally opened the pantry door and wedged a broomstick to keep it ajar, my hands shook so badly I dropped the ladle. Clara arrived after supper, wearing a cloak too big for her frame. Her eyes darted everywhere, like a rabbit waiting for the hawk. You ready? I asked. She nodded. But Thomas didn't show. We waited in the pantry for nearly an hour, crammed between sacks of flour and barrels of salted pork. Clara paced. I sat on a crate, heart beating like a drum in my ears. Maybe he changed his mind, I said. No, she whispered. He'll come. But when the hour passed and the moon rose high, reality crept in like a rat through the cracks. He's not coming, I said. We need to go. Clara looked torn. I can't leave him. You stay, you die. That's the choice. She looked at me then, really looked. I never thought I'd be depending on you, she said softly. And neither did I replied. Let's move. We slipped through the halls like shadows, past the sleeping quarters, past the parlor where the master had left his brandy half finished. At the north gate, Clara paused, looking back at the house like it was a tomb she was leaving behind. Then she turned and ran. I kept up, my feet light on the packed earth path. My lungs burned, my eyes stung from the cold wind, but I ran with her, until the trees swallowed us whole. It wasn't until we reached the second fork in the trail that we saw him. Thomas. He stepped out of the trees, face hard as iron. You left without me, he said, eyes locked on Clara. We waited, she gasped. You never came. I was followed, he replied. I had to double back. We had to double back. You could have ruined everything. He looked at me then. Why is she here? She helped, Clara said. She saved us. But Thomas didn't look grateful. He stepped closer, hand on the knife tucked in his belt. We don't need her anymore. My blood ran cold. Clara stepped between us. We made a deal. He shook his head. She's a liability, and that's when I knew. He wasn't running for love. He was running for control, for freedom on his own terms, and I was a witness, a loose thread. I ain't going back, I said, voice steady. He lunged. It all happened fast. Too fast. I dodged left. Clara screamed. and Thomas's knife sliced the air where my ribs had been. I grabbed a branch from the ground and swung. Crack! He dropped. Breathing hard, I stared down at his unconscious form. Clara stood frozen, her hand over her mouth. "You still want to run with him?" I asked. She shook her head. "We left him there, in the cold dirt. There in the cold dirt." Whether he woke up or not, I didn't care. We ran again, this time without looking back. At sunrise, we reached the edge of the river. On the far side, a small house waited. Smoke rose from the chimney. A woman stood in the yard, staring across the water like she'd been waiting for us. "Who is she?" I asked. My Aunt Clara said, "She's safe." I nodded. The woman waved us over. We crossed on an old wooden ferry pulled by rope. When we stepped on solid ground, I realized something had changed. I wasn't just helping Clara escape anymore. I was escaping too. We didn't speak much that morning, not while Clara's aunt fed us warm biscuits and bitter coffee, not when she handed me clean clothes that smelled faintly of lavender and smoke, not even when Clara sat on the porch, staring across the river with red-rimmed eyes. The silence between us wasn't heavy. It was full of things that couldn't yet be said. Clara's aunt, Miss Hester, was a tall woman with silver hair braided tight against her scalp. Her skin was dark like mine, her voice low like a lullaby, but her eyes held years of knowing. She didn't ask questions. She just looked at me and said, "You're safe here, for now." I nodded. I didn't believe her, but I nodded. Later that afternoon, Clara came to me with her father's watch, clutched in her palm. "You should take this," she said. I frowned. "Why? He'll come looking for it." "And for me. But if he thinks I'm dead," I shook my head. "You want me to fake your death?" She nodded. "Miss Clara, you ain't thought this through. It's the only way to stop him. If he thinks I drowned, he'll stop hunting. He won't drag you back. He won't kill Thomas, sir." She paused, catching herself. "He won't follow us. And how do I convince him?" She handed me her cloak. "Leave it at the riverbank. Put the watch inside. Let him draw his own conclusions." It was dangerous, but it was smart. And desperate times make strange allies. That night I walked back through the woods alone. I moved fast and quiet, like a fox that knows every snap of a twig could be its end. The stars were out, but the moon was low, casting just enough light to guide my steps. When I reached the riverbank, I found a patch of reeds where the water lapped soft against the shore. I placed the cloak on the rocks, laid the watch on top, and sprinkled some of Clara's perfume across the fabric. It smelled like violets and pride. Then I walked away, but I didn't go far. I waited, crouched low in the trees, watching the shadows, and sure enough, an hour later, I heard hooves. Slow, deliberate, a rider dismounted. I saw him by the glow of his lantern. The master. He moved like a man aged 10 years in a night. He saw the cloak. He knelt. He picked up the watch. And then he let out a sound I'll never forget. It wasn't a scream. It was a growl, a beast mourning its own reflection. He didn't cry. He didn't shout. He just stood there, holding the cloak like it was a corpse. Then he dropped it, and he burned it, right there on the rocks. Flames licking at the cloth, smoke curling into the trees. As the fire crackled, he whispered, "You foolish girl," and then he walked away. I waited until the fire had turned to ash before I moved. The cloak was gone, the watch had melted, and in its place, a silence deeper than the night. I turned and ran, not back to Hester's, but south, toward Charleston, toward freedom. I didn't tell Clara where I was going. I knew she'd beg me to stay, say we needed to lie low, but I couldn't. Not anymore. My chance was now. The roads were dangerous. I stayed off them. I moved through brush and creeks, climbed fences, and slipped through thickets. My feet bled. My hands cracked. But I kept moving. 2 days in, I met a man who called himself Elias, a free black man with a wagon full of potatoes and stories. He looked at me and said, "You running?" I didn't answer. He smiled. "Hop in. I don't ask questions if you don't tell lies." We rode for hours. He gave me water, bread, a hat to keep the sun from cooking my scalp. When we reached the edge of Charleston, he stopped. "This is where I leave you." "Why help me?" I asked. He shrugged. He shrugged. "Here some debts don't need names. You stay small, you stay small." I nodded. "Thank you." He tipped his hat. "Don't get caught." Charleston was bigger than I imagined. Louder. The air smelled of salt, sweat, and something sweet I couldn't. I didn't know where to go, but I knew what I was looking for. A woman named Mabel. A name passed down through kitchen whispers like a secret hymn. Mabel helps those who ain't supposed to be helped. I asked a washerwoman near the docks. She gave me a look like she knew my whole story, then pointed me to a row of shacks near the edge of the market. Mabel's place was painted blue, the color of warding. Her front steps creaked under my feet. She opened the door before I knocked. "You're late," she said. "What?" She grinned. "Hi," said, "you're late." Then she pulled me inside and bolted the door. Mabel was short, round and sharp as a blade. Her house smelled of mint and onions. She gave me stew, made me soak my feet, and handed me a dress that fit too well to be coincidence. "You know who I am?" I asked. "I know what you're running from," she said. "That's enough." I told her everything. Not because I trusted her, but because I had nowhere left to carry it. When I finished, she sat quiet for a long time. Finally, she said, "You ever think about what comes next?" I blinked. "Next? After surviving, after running, what do you become?" I didn't have an answer. She leaned back. "You're not just a girl who escaped. You're a girl who made a man believe his world ended. You're not free yet, but you've made him believe you are. That's power." I sat with that, let it settle in my bones. I wasn't just surviving. I was rewriting my story. That night, as I lay in the attic room Mabel offered me, I stared at the ceiling. For the first time in my life, I wasn't listening for footsteps, for keys, for screaming. I was listening to silence, and it sounded like hope. Weeks passed in Charleston like hours, caught between thunderclaps. I took a job at a seamstress shop on the edge of the market, stitching buttons and hems, with fingers still rough from the fields. The shop owner, Miss Pauline, was kind in the way people are when they've seen too much to ask too many questions. She paid in coin and kept her mouth shut. That was all I needed. Every evening I returned to Mabel's house. It became a shelter in the storm of my thoughts. She never pried, never prodded, just left food at my door and asked only that I didn't bring trouble home. I kept to myself. I kept my head down. But inside I was waiting, not for someone, but for something. And then it came. A letter, no stamp, no name. Just a scrap of parchment slid under Mabel's door one morning, name on the front. Just my first name. I opened it with trembling hands. The river took her, they say, but I know better. If she ever reads this, tell her, "You can burn what you want, but ashes still blow in the wind." T. Ian, I read it once. Then again. T. Thomas, how he found me I didn't know. Maybe he hadn't. Maybe it was a gamble. Maybe it wasn't even from him. But the handwriting, it was his. He used to scribble prayers in the stable loft, pretending he knew how to spell them. He knew. He knew I was alive. And that changed everything. I couldn't sleep that night. I sat on the floor, the letter in one hand, the other clutched around the necklace Clara had given me the night we ran. I thought I had buried the past. I thought I'd drowned it in the river and lit it on fire for good measure. But ashes still blow in the wind. The next morning I went to Mabel. I need to go back. She didn't look surprised, just tired. Why? Because someone still knows, and someone might still be in danger. "You mean Thomas?" I nodded. "You don't owe him anything," she said softly. "He made his choice. But he didn't ask for this. I brought him into it." Mabel sighed. "A vengeance doesn't end just because you left the battlefield." "I'm not looking for vengeance," I whispered. "I'm looking for closure." That was a lie. I was looking for answers. 2 days later, I left Charleston before dawn. Mabel handed me a satchel of bread, dried apples, and one of her sharp kitchen knives. "You won't be welcome back," she warned. "I don't expect to return." She gave me a long look. "Then make it count." The road back was colder than I remembered. Leaves were falling in clumps now, the ground a patchwork golden rot. Every shadow looked like a memory, every sound a ghost trailing behind me. I reached the outskirts of the plantation just as the sun was bleeding over the horizon. I stayed in the woods, close to the tree line, watching. The big house was still standing, lace polished now, a cracked window on the second floor, the paint fading, but the barn was gone, burnt to the foundation, charred beams clawing at the sky like ribs of a dead animal. I crept closer. Behind the ruins of the barn stood a new structure. Smaller. Simple. A single-room shack with smoke curling from its chimney. That's where I found Thomas. He looked older. Leaner. The kind of thin that comes from carrying weight that doesn't show on scales. He didn't flinch when I knocked. He just opened the door and stared. "I thought it was you," he said. "I hoped it wasn't." I stepped inside. He offered no greeting, no hug, just silence. "I got your letter," I said. "I figured." We sat on opposite ends of the room. There was one chair, so I took the floor. He offered me nothing. "They think Clara's dead," he said after a while. "The master had a priest come, held a service by the river, cried like he'd lost his only child." I swallowed hard. "What about you?" I asked. "He blames me, says I corrupted her, made her soft." "I'm sorry." Thomas looked away. "Don't be," I said, "Kubo. Don't be. I do it again, but that doesn't mean I'm not paying for it." He lifted his sleeve. "Scar. Fresh ones. He beat you." He nodded. "Why didn't you run? And go where? Not all of us have guardian angels with safe houses and seamstress jobs." I flinched. I didn't ask for this, I said. No, but you left me behind. I looked down. I thought you'd be safer. Safer ain't the same as free. Silence again, and he said, so why'd you come back? To see if it was true. If what was true, that you were still here, that he still had power. Thomas leaned forward. He's dying, you know. I blinked. What? Blinked. What? A cancer. Or something like it. Eats him from the inside. He walks with a cane now. Talks to ghosts. Says Clara visits him in his dreams. Always wet. Always silent. I shivered. Does he know you're here? I know, and he won't. Thomas stood. Then you need to leave. Now. Before he smells the past on you, I came to finish something. He shook his head. Whatever you think you're doing, it won't change what's been done. I'm not here to change the past, I said. I'm here to bury it. As I left his shack, I saw it. A grave behind the barn ruins, unmarked, fresh dirt. I didn't ask who it belonged to. Some things don't need names. Night fell fast in those parts, the kind of thick darkness that made even your own breath feel like a stranger. I waited in the woods, my back against the trunk of a hickory tree. From there, I watched the plantation house flicker with lamplight. It was strange sitting so close to the place where my nightmares were born. The house looked smaller now, more human, but still dangerous. I had a plan. Not revenge, not exactly, but justice in a language my ancestors would understand. Back in Charleston, I'd gotten hold of something from an old woman who ran a root shop. She said it had no taste, no smell, just consequences. Said it was used by women who couldn't scream, by mothers who couldn't fight back with fists. I never asked what it was. I just paid. Now it rested in the bottom of my satchel, inside a small corked bottle, waiting for the moment. I crept closer to the house. No dogs barked, no watchmen stirred. They were ghosts now, or close to it. Inside, the master's health had shriveled like tobacco left too long in the sun. I peered through the parlor window. He sat at a long table alone, cane leaning beside him, his head bobbing between bites like it took all his strength just to chew. A servant girl, young, frightened, moved silently behind him, refilling his cup. She looked too much like I once did, like Clara. I made my way to the back, through the pantry door. I used to slip through as a girl when I was stealing sweet biscuits. Nothing had changed. Even the chipped bowl on the second shelf was still there. I waited for the servant girl to return to the kitchen. When she did, I stepped from the shadows and placed a hand gently over her mouth. She froze. I won't hurt you, I whispered. I was you once. Her eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. I released her slowly. Can you tell me something? She didn't speak, just nodded again. Does he eat everything brought to him? She nodded once more. I pulled the bottle from my satchel and handed it to her. All of this? In his wine? Tonight. She looked at it, confused. It would kill him, she mouthed. I hesitated. It'll set him free, I said. The girl took it and slipped back into the dining room like mist. I didn't wait in the house. I left the way I came, back through the pantry, back into the dark. I walked until I reached the edge of the woods, then turned and watched the house from a distance. The windows flickered. Then one went dark. Another, until finally the whole house sat still, no light, no sound. I didn't know what that meant. I didn't know if the girl had followed through. But I hoped. I stayed in the woods for 3 more days. On the second day, a notice was nailed to the church doors in town. I saw it when I passed through the edge of the village. The master's death had been declared peaceful in his sleep. Peaceful. That word stung more than it should have. But I smiled anyway, just a little, because sometimes peace is a lie, and sometimes it's the most painful truth you can deliver. On the 3rd day, I went back to the plantation one last time. I didn't go to the house. I didn't care to see his grave. I went to the stables. They were empty now, cobwebbed and hollow, but in the rafters, carved into the old beams, I found the initials we'd etched long ago, C&T. I added an M beside them, just one scratch, one letter, enough. Then I walked back outside and turned to the girl from the kitchen. She stood by the tree line, the same look of fear and wonder I had worn all my life. You're free now, I told her. She didn't believe me. I didn't either. The death didn't. But sometimes saying it is the start. I never told anyone exactly what happened that night. Not in Charleston, not to Mabel, not even to Thomas. But a year later, I returned to that road, not to stay, just to see. The plantation had been sold, torn down, the land broken into pieces. Some were sold to freedmen, others left to weeds and time. I stood on the edge of it all, watching children run where once there had been blood, and I realized something. Revenge doesn't always roar like fire. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it waits, and sometimes it walks away with a clean heart and dirty hands. A month passed, maybe more. Time stopped meaning much once I left that land behind. I headed south, not really knowing why, only that I needed distance. Distance from the house, from the memories, from the girl I used to be. But even the ocean couldn't wash away everything. Down in Savannah, I found work in a small bakery run by a widow named Miss Eleanor. She didn't ask questions. She didn't flinch when she saw the brand on my shoulder. She just handed me an apron and said, "Everyone burns in their own way. Just don't let it stop you from making good bread." For once, I wasn't someone's property. I was just me. Every morning, I baked loaves before the sun rose. The smell of yeast and flour reminded me of Mama's kitchen. The days moved slow but steady. I was beginning to forget the way pain used to sit on my chest like a stone. Until one morning, I saw Clara, not her exactly, but a girl who moved like her. Same posture, same soft eyes, but sharper now, like they'd seen more than they should have. She stood across the street, staring at me through the bakery window. I dropped the pan in my hands. When I went outside, she was gone. That night, I sat by the river for hours, wondering if grief could dress itself in familiar faces, if guilt could make ghosts walk in daylight. But something deep in my bones told me Clara was still out there, alive, changed. Like me, 3 days later, I got a letter. There was no return address, no name, just 3 words. "He's not dead." That was all. I knew who it meant, and I knew what I had to do. I packed my things before the sun rose. Miss Eleanor met me at the door with a loaf of sweet bread and a folded cloth pouch. "I didn't think you'd stay long," she said. "Why?" "Because you've still got eyes that look backward." I didn't deny it. She handed me the pouch. Inside were coins, more than I'd ever held at one time. "Go do what you need," she said, "but don't come back half alive." I traveled for weeks, walking, riding wagons when I could. I slept under trees, in barns, once even in a church pew with a Bible under my head. And then, one night, I found myself back where it all started. The land was still marked, even if the house was gone, but the overseer's cabin, still standing. I approached it slowly. No light, no sound. The door creaked when I pushed it open. The air inside smelled like rotten mold, like something that had refused to die. Then I saw him, old, thin, sitting in a wooden chair like he'd been waiting. His beard had grayed. His hands shook as he reached for a bottle. But those eyes, they were the same, cold, empty, like he had never had a soul to begin with. "I knew you'd come back," he said. I said nothing. He said nothing. He chuckled, the sound like gravel in his throat. "They told me you died, that you were buried behind the stables. But I said no. That girl had fire. She wouldn't go down that easy. Still, I said nothing." He poured himself a drink with trembling fingers. "You think you won?" he asked. "That killing him made you free?" Finally, I spoke. "I didn't kill him. A girl with no name did." He smirked. "It doesn't matter. They never cared about names. Just obedience." I stepped closer. "Oh, why are you still here?" He raised his cup. "Because a man should die in the house he built." "No," I said. "The man should die in the hell he created." He looked up sharply. "You came to finish me?" I didn't answer. I just reached into my satchel and pulled out the second bottle from Charleston. The one I hadn't used, the one meant for him. I placed it on the table in front of him. His hands shook as he stared at it. "You think I'll drink this?" "I think you already have," I whispered. His face twisted. "A liar." But already his mouth was turning dry, his skin pale. "You always like to drink at dusk," I said. "So I came before the sunset." He stood up, tried to grab my arm, but stumbled, collapsed into the chair. "You, which?" "No," I said. "Just a woman who remembered." I walked away before he stopped breathing. I didn't need to see the end. The beginning was enough. Outside, the sky was burning orange, and for the first time, I didn't look back. I didn't sleep that night, not because I was scared, but because something inside me had begun to settle, like dust falling in a room that had been shaking for too long. By dawn, I stood in front of the ruins of the master's mansion. The fire had taken most of it years ago now, but the foundation was still there. Cracked stones, charred beams, and silence. So much silence, I walked the edge of the ruins, letting my feet trace paths I had once walked barefoot, hauling buckets, carrying trays bearing bruises. My fingers grazed the edge of what used to be the front steps, the place where Mama had once collapsed, clutching her chest, where Clara had once sung to herself as she plucked feathers from a dead hen, where the master had once stood, belt in hand, calling us his creations. I dropped to my knees and started digging. At first it was just dirt, dry, brittle, clumped in hard knots. But then it turned softer, darker, and then I found them. Bones, small ones, dozens of them, buried beneath the kitchen wall. Not animal bones, not tools. These were human, children. Girls probably, like the ones who went missing over the years. Girls they said had run off or been sold downriver. But I remembered their eyes, their voices, their laughter, and then their silence. He'd buried them here, like broken dishes. I cried, not because I was sad, but because I hadn't known, hadn't guessed the full weight of the evil I'd escaped, and because some part of me had still believed I was the worst thing that ever happened in that house. But now I knew better. I built a small mound over the bones, stacked stones, wrapped it in ivy, and I sang. A song my mama used to hum when she braided my hair. The one that didn't have words, just a rhythm, slow, aching, full of something that felt like home. I lit a candle, let it burn, and when it finally guttered out, I whispered their names. The ones I remembered. The ones I didn't, I called a sister to them. And then I walked away. I headed west. Didn't know where I was going. Didn't much care. Somewhere the soil hadn't been soaked in our blood. Somewhere people might look at me and see a woman, not a warning. In a small town near the Mississippi River, I found a man named Ezra. He ran a print shop. Made newspapers and pamphlets. He hired me to sweep the floors, then to mix the ink, and eventually to write. I used a different name, one no one could trace, and I wrote stories. Not fiction, truth, the kind that bled, stories of women who never got a grave, of men who got away with too much, of families torn apart and stitched back together with scars. Ezra printed them, and slowly people began to read. One night he asked me, "Why do you write these things?" I stared at the press, at the ink staining my fingertips. "Oh, because someone has to remember," I said. "And you think that'll fix things?" I looked at him, and no, but forgetting never helped either. Years passed, people came and went, the world spun forward, but every time I heard a young girl laugh freely in the street or saw a black woman walking with her head high, I knew something had changed. Not everything, not enough, but something is all you need. One spring I returned to the plantation one last time. It was just woods now, overgrown, quiet. But the graves I'd made, still there, the stones worn, the ivy thick, but they stood. And I left behind a bouquet of wildflowers. I whispered a prayer, not to God, to them, to the girls whose bones still rested in the dirt, to Clara, to Mama, to the girl I used to be. "I remember," I said, and I meant it. The train ride back was long, but I didn't mind. I had a notebook in my lap, and my pen never stopped moving. Every bump on the track, every whistle of the wind past the windows, it all became part of the rhythm as I wrote. I wasn't writing for a newspaper this time. I was writing for myself. The story wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about survival, about memory, about how even in the darkest places, a small fire can still burn. I arrived in New Orleans under a bruised sky, clouds swollen with rain. The air was thick, humming with the sound of streetcars and brass horns from distant corners. The city pulsed like a heart too full of blood. I made my way to a small boarding house off Rampart Street. The woman who owned it, Miss Lillian, gave me a room in the back. Said she didn't ask questions if you paid on time. I liked her already. The room was plain, a bed, a washstand, a window with cracked shutters. But it was mine, and after all I'd lived through, that meant everything. That night, I walked down to Congo Square, the same square where, once upon a time, our people had danced. Not for show, for survival. Back when drums spoke in secret codes and footsteps meant rebellion. It was quiet now, but I could still feel the echo under the stones. I sat on a bench and listened, not to music, to the past, and then to something else. Footsteps. A girl, maybe 12, with a scarf tied around her head and eyes too old for her face. She watched me, cautious. "You the lady who writes those stories?" I didn't answer at first. Then I nodded. She stepped closer. "Mama says you're dangerous." I smiled. She might be right. Over the next weeks I started teaching girls how to read. They came at night, after work, after school if they were lucky enough to go. Some came barefoot, some came hungry, but they all came with fire in their eyes. I taught them with scraps, old newspapers, hymnals, whatever I could find, and in return they gave me their stories. Not just pain, but dreams. One wanted to be a seamstress, another a midwife. One swore she'd open a school of her own some days. I told them they would. Because if I could make it out, so could they. Ezra sent me letters now and then. He said people were quoting my articles in church meetings and abolitionist circles up north. Said one woman named Harriet even read one aloud in a train car full of freedmen and made 3 grown men cry. I didn't write back often, didn't have the words, but I carried his letters folded in my Bible. Proof that something I'd done mattered, that I wasn't just surviving, I was changing things. One paragraph at a time. One night, I had a dream. I was back in the kitchen of the old house. But everything was reversed. The walls were clean. The fire was warm, not burning. Mama stood at the stove, humming. Clara was combing my hair, and the master, he wasn't there, not even in the corners. It was just us, free. I woke up crying, not from fear, from her. Then one afternoon, I was called to the courthouse. I thought someone had died, but it wasn't death that waited. It was justice. A lawyer handed me a stack of papers, said the state was granting ownership of the land where the plantation used to stand. What hadn't been sold off to me. And no heirs, he said, and no claimants, and the town council figured it best someone with ties to the place got to decide what happened next. I almost laughed. That land had taken everything from me. Now it was mine. But when I held the deed in my hand, something shifted. It wasn't about owning it. It was about reclaiming it. I went back that spring, tore out the rotten wood, cleared the weeds, planted a garden, and I built something new. Not a house, a school, a place where no girl would be silenced again. We called it the House of Clara, and every girl who walked through the doors knew her name, knew her story, and knew that silence could be broken. The House of Clara stood like a lighthouse in a field once soaked in blood. People came from miles away just to see it. Some brought books, others brought their children. A few just wanted to touch the walls, to believe something good could grow in that cursed soil. I let them. Every brick was a prayer, every nail a vow. We held our first class under a sky so blue it hurt. There were only 5 girls at first. Different ages, different scars, but the same hunger in their eyes. Not for food, for knowledge. One of them, Sarah, asked if she could learn French. Said her grandmother once whispered prayers in it. Another wanted to read maps, said she was going to travel the world and send us postcards from every stop. I told them we'd need a wall to hang those postcards on. We built one together that very afternoon. That winter, the snow came early. It dusted the fields like powdered sugar and crept into every crack of the schoolhouse. I patched the holes with old quilts and extra pages from my manuscripts. The cold made us huddle close, read louder, write longer. It also brought memories. Some nights I sat by the fire and remembered Clara's laughter, the way she used to braid my hair too tight and sing off key. I remembered Mama's hands, always moving, kneading, sewing, healing. I wrote their names on a slip of paper and buried it under the steps of the school. So they'd be part of its foundation, so they'd never be forgotten. News traveled faster than I expected. By spring we had 15 students. By summer 32. Some had never held a pencil, others had been whipped for trying. But here they were writers, thinkers, dreamers. We printed a newsletter called Voices from the Field. It wasn't fancy, but it was ours. One edition featured a poem from a 12-year-old girl named Letty. My mama was cotton, my papa was fire. I'm made of thunder and reaching higher. I cried when I read it, and not quietly, and not quietly. Ezra came down that fall. He walked the fields with me, hands in his pockets, eyes full of memory. This place, he said, it feels different. It is, I said. He stayed for a week, taught a class on abolition movements, and handed out pamphlets about voting rights. The girls loved him, especially when he read aloud in funny voices. He asked if I'd ever thought of running for office. I laughed so hard I spilled ink across a stack of lesson plans. But the thought stayed with me. Not for power, for protection. If I could make laws, maybe I could stop the next Clara from dying and dying. Trouble still knocked sometimes. A man once rode up on a horse, red-faced and drunk, shouting that we were poisoning children's minds. I stood on the porch with a shotgun. Didn't say a word, just looked him in the eye until he turned that horse around. Another time, the mayor sent a letter, said we were encouraged to shut down due to lack of accreditation. Ezra helped me draft a reply. 3 weeks later, we were officially recognized by the state. Sometimes you didn't need to raise your voice, just raise your pen. I watched my girls grow into women, watched them leave and come back. One became a nurse, another a reporter. 2 started their own schools. 1 started a bakery and sent us sweet rolls every Wednesday. They carved their names into desks, into walls, into the world. And when they returned, they brought stories, not of sorrow, but of strength. On the school's 10th anniversary, we held a celebration. People came from 6 counties. There was music, dancing, speeches. Even the mayor showed up with a pie and a handshake. But the moment I remember most was when Letty, now a grown woman with a baby on her hip, stood up and read a new poem. They said we were shadows, but we learned to shine. They tried to erase us, but we wrote the line. The crowd stood, clapped, wept. And in that moment I knew Clara was there. So was Mama. So was every name lost to dust and silence. I never thought I'd live long enough to see generations bloom. But there they were, my girls' daughters, and their daughters too, running across the same grass where Clara once fell. Only now, the soil gave life instead of swallowing it. One of them, little Myra, came to me with a dandelion crown and said, "Miss Eddie, were you always this brave?" I laughed and asked, "Braver than what?" She said, "Braver than the monsters in bedtime stories." And I said, "Child, I was the monster in their stories, and I'm proud of it." She blinked. Didn't quite understand, but one day she would. The school had become more than a school. It was a refuge, a stage, a sanctuary. Weddings were held there, funerals too. One student got married under the old pecan tree, reading vows she'd written during my poetry class. Another son was baptized in a copper tub near the back porch, the same tub we once used for washing slate boards. Time passed gently, but with purpose. Ezra came less often. He was busy up north, fighting new battles in bigger rooms. We wrote letters, though. He always signed them. "Still standing with you." And I believed him. There was an old quilt we kept in the reading room, frayed at the edges, faded in the middle. Each patch was sewn by a student. Some had poems stitched into them. Others bore initials, stars, or tiny stitched fists. One girl who'd never spoken a word stitched a single word into hers. A free, that quilt told a story no book ever could. It was my favorite lesson plan. I started waking earlier, sleeping less. Not from worry, from wonder. Each sunrise brought more than light. It brought proof. Proof that something good had taken root, that vengeance hadn't consumed me, that I had chosen to build instead of burn, and the world hadn't collapsed because of it. I had once thought revenge was all I had. But this legacy was so much more. One evening, as fireflies blinked over the field, I stood where the barn used to be, where Clara had bled, where I had screamed, where everything changed. I lit a candle, held it to the wind, and let it go. It flickered out fast, but I didn't mind. I had enough light now. I didn't need to carry the flame alone anymore. The mayor invited me to speak at a town ceremony, said they were erecting a statue in the new park, a woman reading to children, cast in bronze. They didn't say it was me, but I recognized the braid. I wore the same one that day. The speech was short. I only said, "We are not what they made us. We are what we chose next." The crowd stood quiet, no applause, but every face was listening. Sometimes silence means more than shouting. My hands don't write like they used to. Bones stiff, letters come slow. But I keep a journal by the window, filled with final thoughts, old memories, names I never want to forget. Mama, Clara, Ezra, even the master's son. Forgiveness didn't come easy. Still hasn't, maybe, but I wrote his name anyway. History needs the truth, not just the tidy version. On my last birthday, the girls surprised me. They'd repainted the schoolhouse, planted roses by the steps, and named a scholarship in Clara's honor. There was a cake, badly frosted but sweet as anything. As I blew out the candles, someone asked what I wished for. I said I already got it. Because I had. One morning, I woke before the sun slipped on my shawl, walked barefoot to the porch. The world was still. No footsteps, no burden, just wind, soft and steady like Mama's humming. I sat in the rocker, pulled the quilt over my lap, and closed my eyes. And for the first time in decades, I dreamed of peace. Not fire, not blood, not screams, just peace. They say I passed with a smile, that my hands were folded, and the birds didn't stop singing. They buried me beneath the old magnolia, the one Clara and I used to climb. Carved my name into a stone that reads, "She taught us to speak, to fight, to build. She left us louder than she found us. The school still stands. The girls still come, and every spring they gather under the tree, read aloud my favorite poems, and pass around a battered quilt full of names stitched in freedom. Because legacies don't die, they echo, they rise, they teach, and long after the fires go out, someone always keeps the light." The world moved on without me, but not really, because even in death my name lived on in whispers, in ink, in brick and bloom. They wrote about me in textbooks, briefly of course. Eddie, an early educator of freed slaves in Georgia. That's all. No mention of blood, of Clara, of what it cost. But the girls knew. The real story passed hand to hand like a sacred ember, alive in letters, in stories, in songs sung low over washboards and kitchen pots. They called it Eddie's prayer. It wasn't even a prayer. Just 3 words I once said on a tired night. And not this time. Not this time when a master raised his voice. Not this time when a girl was told she couldn't learn. Not this time when history tried to forget our names. Those words stuck like gumbo to ribs. I never imagined I'd be myth, but they turned me into one. They made plays about me, shadow puppets and children's books, even a folk opera that played once in Atlanta. Someone painted a mural downtown. It showed me holding a book in one hand and a broken chain in the other. Funny how they forgot the knife, the shovel, The screams. Maybe that was for the best. Let them keep their softer version. I never needed statues. I just needed them to remember Clara. One of the girls, Myra, all grown up, opened a second school in Mississippi, named it a Clara's house. I wept when I saw the photos. Same red steps, same wide porch. She even built a bell tower, said the bell would ring every morning at dawn to wake up justice. That's what she called it, waking up justice. A researcher came one day, white man, glasses, voice too careful, said he was writing a book, asked to see my journals. The girls gave him copies, but not the real ones. Too dangerous, they said, too sacred. He asked why we didn't donate them to a museum. Myra just smiled and said, because some truths need guardians. He didn't understand. He never would. I wish Clara could have seen all this. The light, the laughter, the freedom. I think she sees it, though. Sometimes when the wind bends just right and the pecan trees lean in close, I swear I hear her laugh. Soft and sure, like she's saying, did it, you really did it, you really. One student, barely 10, once asked me, if we were born again, would you still be a teacher? And I said, a child. I was never just a teacher. She asked, then what were you? And I said, I was the fire they thought they put out. She didn't get it. Not then, but one day she will. She'll light the next match. The new girls know nothing of chains, but they carry something heavier, memory. They carry stories like armor, and that's what I wanted all along. Not to be remembered as a victim or even a hero, but as a start, as a spark, as the reason someone chose to stand up instead of stay silent. History didn't write me in gold, didn't honor me with medals or dates on calendars, but I never needed their paper crowns. I made queens from broken girls, and kings from boys who only knew how to run. That's enough for me, always was. Always will be. I don't know where I'll go when the last breath leaves me. Heaven? Maybe. Hell? Unlikely, unless they admit troublemakers. But if I had to choose, I'd go where Clara is, where girls still giggle behind school books and boys still whisper poems on porches, where sugar boils on the stove and the air smells like jasmine and ink, where the chains never touched us. Not once, not ever. They say you die twice, once when your heart stops and once when your name is spoken for the last time. But me, I made sure my name would never disappear. Not because I loved the sound of it, but because they tried so hard to erase it. Because for every Edie there were 10 more, nameless, faceless, voiceless, buried under cotton and silence. So I wrote, and I taught, and I bled, if that's what it took. I whispered the names of the forgotten until the walls shook with them. Until even the wind knew how to say we were here, because we were. Every time a black girl holds a pencil like a sword, that's me. Every time a student reads under covers with a flashlight long past bedtime, that's me too. Every time someone tells a story that isn't in the history books, that's one more blow against the forgetting. That's my revenge. The quiet kind, the lasting kind. There's a wooden box under the floorboards of the old house, locked tight with rusted nails. Inside, my letters, Clara's drawings. The first lesson plans I ever made on scrap cloth, a ribbon from the night we danced under the stars before everything went dark. Someday someone will find it, and they'll know. They'll feel it. The truth under all the noise, the heartbeat that never stopped. I once asked Clara, what do you think happens when we die? She said, I think we become the sky. I laughed. The clouds? I asked. She shook her head. No, Eddie, the sky, the whole thing, big enough to hold all the things we never got to be. That stayed with me, still does. So if you ever look up and feel something watching, a presence, calm and certain, that's probably me. The sky, and Clara, and every girl they tried to break, was still here, still teaching, still fighting, still writing, still writing. This story, it ain't neat, it ain't clean. It don't end with a bow or a moral or a pretty little hymn. It ends the way it lived, raw, real, and reaching. It ends with you holding it now, wondering what comes next. So I'll ask you, just like I asked those girls, now that you know the truth, what will you do with it? I don't know where I'll go when the last breath leaves me. Heaven? Maybe. Hell? Unlikely, unless they admit troublemakers. But if I had to choose, I'd go where Clara is, where girls still giggle behind school books and boys still whisper poems on porches, where sugar boils on the stove and the air smells like jasmine and ink, where the chains never touched us. Not once, not ever. They say you die twice, once when your heart stops and once when your name is spoken for the last time. But me, I made sure my name would never disappear. Not because I loved the sound of it, but because they tried so hard to erase it. Because for every Edie there were 10 more, nameless, faceless, voiceless, buried under cotton and silence. So I wrote, and I taught, and I bled, if that's what it took. I whispered the names of the forgotten until the walls shook with them. Until even the wind knew how to say we were here, because we were. Every time a black girl holds a pencil like a sword, that's me. Every time a student reads under covers with a flashlight long past bedtime, that's me too. Every time someone tells a story that isn't in the history books, that's one more blow against the forgetting. That's my revenge. The quiet kind, the lasting kind. There's a wooden box under the floorboards of the old house, locked tight with rusted nails. Inside, my letters, Clara's drawings. The first lesson plans I ever made on scrap cloth. A ribbon from the night we danced under the stars before everything went dark. Someday someone will find it, and they'll know. They'll feel it. The truth under all the noise, the heartbeat that never stopped. I once asked Clara, what do you think happens when we die? She said, I think we become the sky. I laughed. Clouds? I asked. She shook her head. No, Eddie, the sky, the whole thing, big enough to hold all the things we never got to be. That stayed with me, still does. So if you ever look up and feel something watching, a presence, calm and certain, that's probably me. The sky, and Clara, and every girl they tried to break, was still here, still teaching, still fighting, still writing. Still writing. This story, it ain't neat, it ain't clean. It don't end with a bow or a moral or a pretty little hymn. It ends the way it lived, raw, real, and reaching. It ends with you holding it now, wondering what comes next. So I'll ask you just like I asked those girls. Now that you know the truth, what will you do with it?